and for about 2 months worked on this, and now I have a grandfather clock in my living room that works. It it keeps the time. It's actually square. I mean, it looks pretty good. I call it a sunflower clock because I purchased wallpaper and put it on the back of it in a time where we're yearning for sunlight, and it's painted a kind of a light sunflower yellow color, and we need to create things that have great symbolic value for ourselves now, right? Don't we? We need things that just shine out with creative meaning, like something to measure time with in a pandemic year.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Different Boat, Same Storm, a video podcast aimed at kindling empathy amidst a global pandemic.
We are so excited to have this new episode for you today where we're talking to Michael Trice. Michael is an amazing person. We'll learn all about his story, learn about the work that he does, and understand his experiences and his viewpoints on the pandemic and everything that we're going through right now. Michael and I actually go back a few years to the Parliament of World Religions Conference in 2018. We met in Toronto, and where I'm coincidentally now a student in university. Michael, it's so great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and thank you both for inviting me over. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this kind of just conversation where we can discuss these major themes that you are setting in front of the table, and there's nothing better than how we think about what we're all experiencing right now in the world. So with humility, I'm real pleased to be here. Absolutely.
Thank you for being here, Michael. It would be amazing if you could just introduce yourself briefly for our audience.
Sure. I'm a person who never expected to be a professor. I was raised in, this was not in the cards if you ask my friends from high school. Mm-hmm. It's all these years later. I was raised in New Mexico. I did well enough in school, but I was really connected to the land in that area, the southwest of the United States, and ended up really developing an interest in the role of public policy and religion and law, and pursued those, and eventually, after living in different parts of the world, came back to the United States and lived and worked in Chicago for a number of years, and then found myself in Seattle, Washington, where I'm at Seattle University. I'm a constructive theologian, which is to say I'm a person who, if you love to work in an interdisciplinary way, if you love to work kind of integrationist between different ideas and thoughts and reflections, and if you love working with people, it's a great job. So it's a gig, and I love it. And I've been a faculty member. I'm a tenured faculty here for the last 10 years. And I run the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs also at Seattle University. And on top of all of that, as I was driving about 2.5 years ago, I was on exit 151A in Seattle, and it just dawned on me, as it does in our lives sometimes, like there's an idea. We all have ideas we want to create in the world. And for me, it was this idea of Religica. So I started and founded Religica, and it's a platform for the role of religious traditions and spiritual pathways and indigenous wisdom and the impact positively that it can have on the world. And I've been doing that for 2 years too. So, when I have free time, I love to go for walks, and I've got a dog and just a terrific group of friends, colleagues, and family. So that's a little bit. How's that?
No, I love that. I love that there's such a smattering of things, but there's an underlying thread that brings them all together. It's fascinating that you bring about the topic of religion and faith and this connection to land. In a time where there's so much uncertainty around us, I feel like we all need a little bit of faith. We all need a little bit of reassurance in some regards or the other, whether it be religious or not. And I'm wondering what your thoughts and what your experiences have been in that regard as somebody whose work is literally all of this.
Oh yeah, that's a phenomenal question. I'll give it my best shot for just providing just a quick sense of how we're dealing with it. I have to say, there's a number of folks who report to me, and by that I mean in our work, in a way that keeps me really accountable to showing up with authenticity and recognizing with honesty what they've been experiencing over the past year. Mm. And even though most of those folks will say most of the time, yes, this is impacting me, the pandemic, but it's not impacting me the way it would, let's say, someone else, whoever that person may be. But the reality is, it is impacting them. And what I'm experiencing and seeing in the people around me is a level of acknowledgement of grief, a grief connected to, as you have mentioned, the land, our abuse of the land, our abuse of the water and of the air, and a recognition perhaps somewhere deeply, existentially, that we are responsible for what is happening around us. All of that is uneven too, but I think the recognition of that grief is pretty comprehensive. But I think the other is, once you get further through grief, maybe acknowledging that also gives license to a certain level of creativity, like a hunger, a yearning for rolling up our sleeves, so to speak, and not allowing grief to become a kind of thing we're entombed in, but that there is this impulse in us collectively to be creative. And I'm seeing a lot of that too, across industry, in my field and other places. So I find that really reassuring. Amidst the turmoil, there's always this, like the storm, these boats, things are being jostled. You're reminding me, if I say one other thing about this, grief to me in this time feels like, across religions, I should say, most of the major religions and spiritual pathways, there is this image of a storm that is used as a trope inside much of the literature. And I was just thinking with a friend of mine the other day about the Hebrew experience of the storm that kind of rolls through a text, a narrative. Like you're reading a narrative and something's happening, and here comes this storm like a whirlwind. It's typically referred to as a whirlwind. It rolls through and upends everything. It rearranges the furniture in the lives of the people and then tosses their lives aside, and then it moves out, indiscriminate, impartial, impersonal, but devastating. And I think if we're honest with each other, there is a sense in which the storms feel like that. There's a lack of control or even influence. And maybe part of the grief is a recognition of our own fragile humanity. Like there's not a lot you can do in the face of a storm like that. And so, just some initial thoughts. That is, I think those kinds of images in literature are there because the human experience over the millennia tells us that storms are a part of the reality of our everyday human walk.
That's fascinating. Like I think we've already gotten so deep into this conversation, talking about grief, about storms, and obviously the different boats that we all exist in this same storm. Michael, can you talk a bit more about this idea of the storm in your own faith context? And your work in Religica has been focused on this interfaith dialogue. And I know you work a lot with other organizations like the Parliament of World Religions, focusing on that interfaith dialogue. What role does faith and religion play during this pandemic? And what have you seen in your work at Religica, where you're collecting stories, where you're bringing awareness about these issues and sharing them in forms like podcasts, videos, articles? And we were just talking, you've reached over 1 million people through your content over the past year. What has that sort of all been like, especially in the faith context?
I think what's happened for me is the more we've done with Religica, the more I realize how much I have to surrender in terms of expectations, because this is something that people do together. Like your ego has to somehow be displaced in order to be really creative with others, because their wisdom fills up the room. And they often know more than I do, and that's not just kind of oratory. Like, it's really true. These folks know a lot more than I do technically and other things that we're doing. So I think humility is hugely important in this time. Just a lack of, we can be ambitious and humble at the same time. It doesn't translate into arrogance. And I think religious lenses and philosophical expressions or reflections make a lot of room for that. You can be really ambitious and humble. Let me just say a word, if I can, to what you've asked. For me, one of the more humbling moments in all of this was last April, when this pandemic was really raging in northern Italy. If you recall, at that time we were looking at 2,000 people a day. There were 600 deaths a day, and it just seemed staggering, and indeed was. And we at Religica, because it's this online platform, we kind of train the metrics to kind of see what's happening in different parts of the world and then target messaging specific to those areas, which we did in northern Italy, the first time we had done that. And the messages weren't about believing in one particular religion over another. It wasn't about adherence to a philosophy or another. We just wanted to remind people that kindness matters, that they can rely on their neighbor, that it's okay to feel brittle, and that when you feel like you don't have everything going for you, you're not alone. And that sometimes just being reassured of those things helps. So we did that. And when we did, over 100,000 people, we could tell were looking at those messages.
Wow.
So the quantity typically doesn't tell a qualitative story, but in this case, it helped us to think about, the fact that these folks are connecting. So what we're trying to do is connect. And my sense on the importance of religion today has a lot to do with this sense of building genuine community. And it's not coerced. It doesn't mean that we have to, we don't co-adopt or steal other people's intellectual property, if you see what I mean, or they're the human bearing in the world. We try to acknowledge that we all come from different places and we have something to give. If this helps, one of the words in my own tradition that we use is the word vocation. And vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which you can hear the word in that voice, right? Like voice. And all of us in my tradition have a kind of vocation we share with the world. And often it's not diminished to career. It's that place where our heart and mind and action all meet. We look out on the world and kind of telescope how we want to be and how we want to contribute. But for me, what's most important as a person of faith is this idea that so close to voice, that vocare, vocation, is where I find expression in the world. It's where I'm kind of finding my voice in the world. And we know that doesn't happen without listening to what's happening in the world. And so there's this wonderful kind of reciprocal relationship of give and take between listening and hearing that's so essential in the world. And for me, that's just been an incredibly important image in this time, to listen well. As was noted, this is a tremendously difficult time, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier, the images of immigration, but also we're looking at serious structural racism. And I'm here in the U.S., and we're addressing. We know, for instance, that on off-ramps of major highway systems, those zip codes where people live, large segments of that population are from the African American community out here. That's also where you see more heart disease and more asthmatic events. Why is that? Because those are unhealthier physical terrain or zones to live in. And that's an injustice. That's a fundamental injustice. And yet that's also a kind of storm. And the pandemic is maybe revealing some things to us. Sorry, guys, I'm going on and on. But, anyway, that's where, how's that for a response to your question? I kind of trailed on, but I care. I'm trying to figure out how that vocation finds expression amidst those injustices today.
Well, the thing is, I don't think either of us wanted to pilfer with the pristineness of that monologue, so we just let the gold flow, and lest we disturb the calm. But I have so many thoughts because there's so much to unpack there. As somebody who is spiritual himself, I find that the humility that you were talking about, it's important to have that humility, but the way that humility comes about is not from realizing that you don't know anything, and that's that. It's realizing that there's so much out there that you can know, and that you never know everything, which means that not knowing is not bad, because you'll never completely know. And there's no harm in accepting that, because everybody's just varying degrees of I don't know. Nobody knows. And just it's liberating to have that as a mindset. And I think spirituality really ingrains that in you as a philosophy to live life by. And again, with uncertainty around us, when we really don't know what's happening, the act of surrender, but at the same time, not helplessness, surrender with active self-agency and initiative is probably the sweet spot in all of these worlds. And anything with a spiritual bend of mind, but based on initiative and action and proactiveness, is probably the best of all of those worlds. I'm wondering if...
Fantastic, yeah. Fantastic. In fact, can we riff on this a little bit?
Absolutely.
I mean, this idea of you named it, liberty. I talk to so many people in my own podcast. There's this sense of people feel this pandemic has been so hard. If you remember the first few months, people didn't go anywhere. They just stayed. Streets emptied. Nature came back. Skies cleared, and people took a deep breath amidst a lot of pain where they could. And a lot of the discussion at the time, as I recall, had been on what you just identified. I can't control this. I have to surrender something. I have to be liberated from maybe a former view of how I thought I was going to be in the world. I can't tell you how many colleagues and friends have said, professors have left positions. I have a friend who's a lawyer who is now a poet. She's walked away from studying law. I mean, like, big change. Some folks have said, I'm using this as an opportunity to retire early at 40. But they're not retiring. They're just choosing something else to do in their lives. They're surrendering. That's the second riff. And the Greek word for this, or the Greek Orthodox experience, is kenosis, like emptying out as surrender. Like, I'm gonna just take it all and let it go. And that provides an opportunity for creation. I'd love to share with you guys. I've built a grandfather clock in last fall. I'm not a carpenter, so I mean, I'm not the person who builds a grandfather clock. But my grandfather was in Germany at the end of World War II, and he bought the kind of innards of this clock back, and it sat in a box until 2013 when my father passed away and handed it to me. And he said, I'd like you to build this clock. We're in a pandemic year. You feel liberated in some ways. You feel grief. You've got to surrender some things to survive it. And in the midst of the concoction, the alloy of all of that, all of a sudden we start getting creative. Look at your podcast. You start to what churns you, I will not be set down through this thing. I'm going to try something different. And so I went downstairs, and I'll send you all a picture of it. I started cutting wood, and for about 2 months worked on this, and now I have a grandfather clock in my living room that works. It it keeps the time. It's actually square. I mean, it looks pretty good. I call it a sunflower clock because I purchased wallpaper and put it on the back of it in a time where we're yearning for sunlight, and it's painted a kind of a light sunflower yellow color, and we need to create things that have great symbolic value for ourselves now, right? Don't we? We need things that just shine out with creative meaning, like something to measure time with in a pandemic year. So I really like what you're saying about liberty and surrender. And I'm riffing the word creativity, but I think this is the time we have.
Yeah. I'm so glad that the Greek word that you brought up of just letting go and emptying out. There's so much that we're holding within us that we don't even realize we're holding, and it's weighing us down, and we don't. And I'm speaking from personal experiences and not me speaking in hypotheticals. There was so much that I didn't even realize was weighing me down until in meditation I realized, wow, I didn't even know this was within me. And the only way to get it out was to actually get it out. But you can't get it out if you don't know that it's in there. So that requires an active effort to kindle cognizance. But that only happens when you A, want to, and B, take steps to do that. And then therein, when you look deep within, when you reflect and introspect, does that creativity spark? Because you're calling to your inner calling, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You're seeking that actively.
I love it. I'd like to ask both of you a question in this regard. I mean, the inner spark, the first thing I'm reminded of is we no matter how well we know ourselves, in so many ways, we still are a mystery to ourselves, aren't we? I mean, there's so much going on in here that, thank goodness, like there's wells to draw from, and if we use water as an image, but spark, I think of Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Christianity, certainly, Judaism, like all these unique expressions of faith identity or religious identity or philosophical identity that refer to something like a spark or an image, a fire, something that needs to be kindled and that needs to be fanned and then needs to just kind of get oxygen and get out into the world. And maybe that's at the heart of creativity. But I resonate with this idea of spark. What do you guys think? What's when you think of an image that comes to mind for just a burst of creativity, is it something like that? Or maybe there's another word you're using?
That's a wonderful question. The burst of creativity and the spark, so to say. I mean, I definitely agree that during the pandemic, personally for me, I think it allowed me to focus a bit more on what was important during the first wave. And then the second wave came of September, and Atharv and I were back to school as students. And I think for then I felt like life was back to normal per se. And I took on a ton of things to do. I felt like I could do anything because things were online. But in that process, I think, again, I forgot that there's only so much that you can focus on. So like I look at faith as a way of, like Atharv, you talked about meditation and kindling that energy in one place. I think for me, it's this understanding that the idea of surrender for me, I think in a very practical lens, it's like, how do you live your life while understanding that you are part of this one? And the oneness is everywhere. The oneness is you are part of that oneness. And beyond that, like as an individual then, if this oneness exists, and again, you can call the oneness God, or you can call the oneness the universe, or you can call the oneness energy. And energy, I guess, is a word that works because we all believe in energy. And if we all believe in this oneness of energy and we are simply a part of it, then how can we kindle our inner passions and desires and what we want to do to spark that creativity? I mean, that's a great question. I'm still thinking about it. Atharv, like, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I sort of have this interstitial phase between spark and water, because I connect with water almost at a spiritual level, because I've been a swimmer all my life, and that's the one thing that I've been missing so much now. And I didn't realize this was one of the things that was weighing down on me, that I've been away from it for so long, something that I find healing me. So when I think of creativity, I think of it as a light that guides me to that well that I can draw from, because the well's always there, but the light acts as a direction, as a reminder that there is so much to draw from. So I think for me, just from my personal experience and my lived experiences, there is fire and water. And might I add, since we were talking about the symbolism of fire, when I think of fire, and especially this is coming from my Hindu background, we think of fire as purifying from within. So in meditation, we think of it as a fire that's starting from within, then that's spreading out from our body and sending out positive energy to all of the universe. So this is all purifying what we have within, and then channeling that and harnessing and knowing how to control it, and just sending those out to the universe and beyond.
Yeah, I love it, you guys. I really, both of you, as I'm thinking about what you're saying, it's interesting too, isn't it, that fire and water is, these are deeply symbolic references, even archetypes. Like fire has a universal appeal, water does too, and what I've always learned about symbols in different religious texts is that they are always pointing beyond themselves in the way that we're talking about. The sense in which, like, fire wants something to arrive. Water is also a symbol for new life. You mentioned, the purity of fire, also the kind of symbol of new life and of new possibilities. And I wonder if, I'd really love to know what you both think about this too. In this time of surrender, I'm not asking myself what I want to do anymore. I'm not asking myself if I want to be a professor or if I want to be just about anything, the guitar player I never became, but had hoped to become. I'm asking myself in the midst of surrender what I cherish. Right? That's a different order word. Right? Like, what is it I'm willing to put my future, I'm willing to mortgage my future on, so to speak, in the present? It's going to be what I cherish. And do I want to participate in a world? I got this from a Hopi elder who I spoke with not too long ago, who talked about water in this way and how we cherish water. And he was talking about it both literally, but the more we discussed it, the more I realized he was talking about something other than water. It was a different kind of water. That cherishing is a different way of loving and being in the world. And it's a certain kind of order of really wanting your activity, who you are being and who you are doing, as being synonymous with the thing you love most. And for me, that's what cherishing brings about in the midst of surrender. But I can only get there when I do what you were mentioning, which is to surrender. I think that's my take on it.
Yeah. Surrender. I think surrender is just such an interesting word as I continue to think about it. Like, I think surrender and the idea of, like, you understand the what will happen in the world. In the Sikh tradition, it's known as hukam, the idea of understanding what is and what will come. Like that the oneness manages what is to come. And I'm just thinking of that in the context of surrender and cherishing. I guess this is even more spiritual and deep now. I'm thinking, like, what is it that we cherish about this human life? Is it that we have it? Is it that we're attached to other things? And what is the point of all this attachment if the trueness and the truth is in that oneness? And I guess this is philosophical and spiritual. I mean, what is the oneness? And I think, how do you connect to that oneness? I think different people have different ways of doing that. And so for some people, it's being in nature that is that oneness and experiencing that. For others, it's meditation and reflecting upon the one and being with that one. I just think, thinking of what you cherish, I wonder, Michael, do you mean in a worldly sense, or do you mean in a broader sense of your aspirations and feelings for life? And Atharv, feel free to chime in. I mean, this is a deep discussion that I think our audience will probably be left wondering about.
Atharv and Abhay, this is great. This is a reason to have conversations on a Friday afternoon, right? Like this. Let me. I love what you said about hukum.
And Michael, if I can jump in, I often think that in previous spiritual traditions, it was thought that you have to isolate from the world. You have to be away from the world in order to be a spiritual person, and only through that are you a good person. But my understanding has always been that you should live a normal life, have a family, engage in the community. And one thing that's central in the multiple faiths that you worked with in your interfaith work is the idea of service. How do you give back to your community and be a good person? So in the context of surrender, then, in the real world, what does that look like for you? And as you were saying,
well, I think we're in the midst of a popular discourse on how we stigmatize, the level of bias that becomes structural, how we objectify, how we create systems of injustice, and how we perpetuate structural cruelty. Mm-hmm. And I think surrender in this regard is the deeper level conversation. I mean, all of that has to happen in society. But if we can't say with some hopefulness that we cherish our collective humanity, that we believe it must not only exist but thrive, and that it thrives through individuals and communities who are doing their utmost to move toward that oneness, to live daily with authenticity and honesty. If we can't say that positively, then anything else we do on that other level will only be procedural. It may work. We'll operationalize how we're going to treat one another. But the deeper reality is, do we believe it? And I don't think there's a lot of shadow inside of cherish. There's not a lot of places to hide. You either love something when you cherish it or you don't. There's not a lot of deception inside of what one cherishes. So I would say, for me, frankly, every day it's about, it's like being honest with yourself. It's about recognizing that the other human beings around us are not objects. They really are living, breathing, fully embodied subjects. And they have hopes. And they have their own internal integrity. And that includes all of us in terms of being participants. Now, that may sound really esoteric, so let me put it a little differently.
Yeah.
I become keenly aware in recent years that I'm finite. I got through my 20s and 30s and 40s. I've entered my early 50s, and I'm like, whoop. Guess what? This has an expiration date. This body only goes so far. So somehow, what I cherish and what I love and what I'm going to be and do in the world is between these two breakers, between these two limits of birth and death. And in the midst of that, I just want to be real. I want to be real with other people. I want to go outside and garden in very specific ways and appreciate the trees and the life and vitality around me because I have this season to do it in. And this is the only season that I have. And it's not to be morbid. It's more like a gift. And surrendering allows me to see the gift more fully. So, when I talk with students, we're having these kinds of conversations about what makes for a meaningful life. And every answer is unique, but the one aspect that is held in common is a recognition that this is the life we have. This is the century we share. This is it. We are on the cusp of the present of our species, and we have things to do here that are inclusive of, but also transcend every religious expression. This is it. This is the moment. That's how I respond to that.
This really is the moment. And I echo those thoughts exactly, and I was hearing that was cathartic almost, if I may put it that way. Because I think this whole notion of I think there's a difference between detachment and disconnectedness. And more often than not, people confuse the two. Detachment means not hooking yourself to the material needs and material elements around you. Not necessarily not using them, just not attaching yourself or your happiness or your self-worth to them. Disconnectedness, on the other hand, is turning yourself off from all of that. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I think there's a difference between the two. And I personally also come from a background where service, everything that I do in life, I've been taught that service has to be at the core of it. And service doesn't have to be of one kind. Service doesn't look like one single act. It's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle in which you commit to giving without any aspiration for taking. Not because you have no expectations, it's because you don't have any expectations. The expectations are not zero, they just don't exist. Giving without any expectations of taking. And giving for the joy of giving. And in terms of cherishing, this notion of cherishing and finding joy and seeking joy in the act of giving in whatever you do, academically, professionally, personally. Giving and service can't be isolated elements and aspects of your life. In every moment, every breathing moment that you have, service has to be and giving has to be at the core of it. And you're in this moment right now. So you have to be giving every single moment because you have no idea what the next moment might bring with itself. And you cannot do anything to change any of the past moments that you've lived in. So all you can do then is try and give to the best of your capabilities right now, every single moment, and just pray that you get more opportunities like that. But the only way to create those opportunities is to start.
Yeah.
And you have to start now, because if not now, then when?
Right. Oh, that's really deeply meaningful, impactful, and really lovely the way you're saying that too, Tarv. I mean, and your use of the word joy, right? I mean, sometimes what we're talking about is perceived, service in particular, is perceived as work, right? But if it's some of the words we've used, if it's vocare, it's vocational, if it's gift, if it's coming from a place of detachment rather than disconnectedness, if it's inclusive of a shared commitment to oneness, then it's not so much work. And that may sound somewhat, rhetorical, but it hasn't been work like that in my life. Most of the service in my life has felt deeply rooted in the experience of joy.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know why that is. I think sometimes dislocated joy is the best kind. It's just a present thing. You're reminding me when I was a kid. I was raised, as I mentioned, in New Mexico, in a part of the state in the U.S. that was where the movie Contact was filmed. So if you've seen that movie, it's just these open western night skies, high altitude, high plateau desert, not a lot of moisture in the air, and it's just starlight. Like in the night, especially on moonless nights, you can see the Milky Way just strewn across the horizon. And you would think viewing something like that would produce also a tremendous level of perhaps feeling like a cosmological drop, like I'm just one in the midst of all of this, and maybe some existential anxiety, like fretting or dread. But in fact, I always felt the kind of joy you're also talking about. And it makes me wonder if the connection between service toward others and the most important moments of just being in the world is a mutual kind of connection to that oneness we described before. And the response in both service, in what we do and how we be, is a kind of reciprocal echo of joy that is conducive to a well-lived and healthy life.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that idea of service, cherishing the collective humanity, as you talked about, Michael, and that level of detachment and not having expectations of what you want to see come out of service, that in itself is that idea of surrendering to and that liberation, so to say, within this temporal phase that we're in, I guess. Wow, just connecting all that together. I just looked at the time. This conversation has flown by so far.
It's great. It's great talking with both of you. I wish we had more time like this. And this is the other thing, isn't it? In a pandemic age, people have discovered how to configure community in a virtual context and have this level of conversation because we need it. We have to have it. And we figured out how the socialized pacing works and how conversation shows up in a time where, like the natural velociraptor in me wants to always have the side conversation looking left and right, but it's also unidriven, right? In this regard, we have to overcome and surrender a lot of our preconceived ideas about how community shows up. And yet here we are on the other side of surrendering it, to your point.
Yeah.
And so, Michael...
Sorry, this one thought that just came to my mind when we were talking about surrender and we were talking about elements of nature before, but just when I think of water as well, its all-encompassing nature, where it surrenders itself to whatever conduit that it is exposed to, and then makes it its own, adds its own flair to it. I think that again is a metaphor that we could all inculcate in the way we live our lives, and that we can't just, it's not just enough to go with the flow. You have to be the flow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, you remind me, can I add one more image to this?
Absolutely.
That's great. Abhay, this is, there's a book called A River Runs Through It. I believe a film was made after this as well. And at one point, he's a fly fisherman. He's out in the middle of the river. And you can feel, even as they're reading the text, you can feel the kind of water coursing across his calves. You know, it's a kind of a mighty. You recognize you're standing in something that you're not an immovable object, but it is an unstoppable force. It's moving beyond you, and you'll stand until you can't anymore. But the river will remain. And he's reflecting on this moment, and he writes that the river, the water, is above the rocks. And this is where it gets relatively esoteric. He said, but the words of life are written under the rocks, under the water. And I've always wondered, what does that mean? You know, it's a wonderful poetic flourish, but how do I get at that? And I've begun to think more recently that, especially during this pandemic, that how we understand the kind of deeper values in our lives, there actually is content to be read. There is actually significance that can be drawn from everything around us, even the things we think are just relatively insignificant. In fact, even the rocks themselves have words of meaningfulness written on them if we can just read what's happening in nature, and read what's happening is how that's impacting our world, and read how that's impacting our health and well-being, etc., and more. I'm just much more attuned, I think. Maybe surrender does that to us as well. It allows us to kind of deeper sense of being attuned. But I've always loved that image of being able to somehow ascertain only partially what the world wants of us in our limited time here. But sometimes that's surrendering. It just allows us to see that partial point, and that's enough. That's enough for us. So.
Yeah. So surrender, liberation, liberty, all these different concepts that are, I guess, again, ingrained in so many different faith backgrounds and religious perspectives. And they're all quite universal. And I mean, again, us three coming from different faith backgrounds, coming to this understanding, I think this is a wonderful conversation. I also wonder, Michael, on a related note, one thing that we like to focus on this podcast is often the idea of optimism, and optimism in light of the storms that we face in the world, and optimism versus positivity, the different things that are that we need to do looking forward to the future. What role do you think that religion and faith play in this world that appears to be becoming more and more secular, and I guess in that sense non-faith, if that makes sense? I mean, what sorts of roles does the organized institutions of the past play in moving forward and having this optimism way of looking at the world in spite of the pandemic, in spite of the climate crisis, and in spite of the mental health crises that we're facing?
If I might add a really quick point here before Michael jumps in, I think there's a difference between secular and non-faith, because secular is more about accepting faiths that are not yours, and non-faith is just, again, disconnecting yourself from faith altogether. So maybe at least that's how I draw the difference. But I'm curious as to how Michael sees this as well.
Yeah, you guys are both teaching me a tremendous amount as I'm thinking about this. I mean, in terms of the religious tradition, we are the rocks underneath which the words are written. And all of those religious traditions are attempting to show us that we belong rock by rock in a deeper kind of spiritual household or house, a structure to which we are essential for its proper building in the world, I would think. And I think the role of religion is to remind us often of the values that are so deeply sinewed, to use a different kind of image, in our lives, that sometimes we don't see it, which means that religion is meant to amplify what is already held or contained within. And what would that be? I think we've hit on some of these words today. Cherish would be one of those, but hope is another. And hope is a renewable resource. I think hope can spring up just about anywhere. Hope has a cross-religious tenacity. It wants to build connections across what people think, because hope also isn't just kind of serving rationality. It is deeply emotional and spiritual and heartfelt. It's transformational. And hope is different from optimism in that regard. I would say that sometimes what we're dealing with is a kind of toxic positivity that gets in the way of what hope intends for us in the world. And toxic positivity shows up in process and in lobbying and in all kinds of ways that we operationalize our lives every day. But, it's kind of like cotton candy. It doesn't really feed us. But hope wants to transform our lives if we'll just allow it a window into us. And I use that example relatively, with some sense of certitude, because so many different religious traditions speak of hope as light or open window or breezeways of opportunity, or kind of wherever you see these images, that's hope rushing through. And also water, We've talked a lot about fire and water, but air is often an element associated with hope in these different religious traditions. And so we have to somehow convince ourselves that a discourse that tears down and diminishes, that refuses to look at discrimination as it's taking place, is given to toxic positivity. And if I could say one other word like this, hope has its own internal discourse. It doesn't like to be fooled. But a lot of what we see in the world, I think, often is an internal language that is more times than not rationalizing a status quo, which is given toward kind of structural cruelties. So the work of hope is not to rationalize what is already an internal language of systemic injustice. Hope is seeking transformation that breaks away from the machinations that are really holding us down. And I think each religion and philosophy is speaking to us directly, not just as community, but speaking directly to our lives between these two limits, about where proximal hope is going to take up residence in our world and in our lives, in a stand often against a kind of toxicity of everyday life, including undue positivity.
I think the difference, the way I look at it, and that was all so profound and beautifully put, between hope and positivity is that positivity almost floats a notion of what we should be, but hope is about what we can be.
Oh, that's great.
There is potential there that, again, drives us towards something far greater than a single milestone that we can see within our sight or that we can imagine. It extends beyond our mortal limits. It's committing ourselves to a higher purpose, and that drives us and everybody around us and everybody who resonates with that same purpose.
Hope is for the collective humanity. We have hope for all of us, not just ourselves as individuals. And I think that illuminates the idea of what we can be, as you beautifully said, Atharv.
Yeah, Atharv, I appreciate that. And Abhay, it's the plural, right?
Yeah.
It's always plural. Abhay, to your point, I think it's absolutely, that's my take on it too. Feels good to say that aloud.
It does. I mean, we're all just, I'm deep in thought now. And I would say this conversation has brought to light this idea of I just keep coming back to what you said, Michael, about collective humanity. How do we cherish that collective humanity in service, in surrender to kind of the greater oneness that we've seen in the world? And I think the pandemic for many of us has been able to illuminate that idea of oneness illuminate that in spite of the systemic challenges that we do face in the world, that it is up to us as individuals not to just do nothing about it, but to rise to the challenge and give back in the ways that we can.
Yeah, I hope so. I do think that's right, and I wonder if going back to the very beginning of our conversation, if hope is so much sweeter when it understands what it doesn't have. Like grief teaches us something, about why hope is so important collectively, and it's a recognition. So experiential hope is like experiential wisdom. You earn it a little bit, and because we all have adversity in one form or another, and we earn it a little bit, and but it brings us back to the plural. Isn't that interesting? Like I may have adversity in my personal life, but it only makes me realize how much I need others. It's interesting.
I think you appreciate life a lot more when there's darkness around you.
I do. I think you're right. Absolutely.
And well, we've been talking a lot about fire.
I hope another volume of this soon. You guys have taught me a lot. This has been a lot of fun.
We need to do like a version 2 of this, a before and after, where we come back with all of these tuning in our minds.
I'll drop what I'm doing because I cherish this a lot more than the other things. I'm delighted, and thank you again, both of you, for inviting me to be in conversation with you. It means a lot to me.
Thank you, Michael. We've been thinking about you since last summer, actually, believe it or not, about talking to you. I mentioned you to Atharv, and thank you so much. We're very grateful to have you on the show. This has been an episode of Different Boat, Same Storm, everyone, a video podcast aimed at kindling empathy amidst the pandemic. We've talked all about religion, but beyond that, the idea of hope, grief, loss, but also the positive things that bring us together as humanity moving forward. Thank you for listening. We look forward to seeing you all very soon.
We'll be back again very soon with a different guest at the same time, in a different boat, but in the same storm.
Great.
Thank you.
Best.
Everybody.